we live? I guess we are. I wasn't paying attention. Well, good morning, everybody. It's time for let me mute something here. I got an echo. Creating some problems on my own here. All right. Well, I'm excited to get started this morning. We're going to be looking at a topic that I don't know that we're very aware of, other than some statements that are made by people in our society, and even Christians. Sometimes we struggle with looking at the book of Genesis and understanding, is it something that is mythical? Is it historical? I grew up believing that it was what it said. I mean, that's what I was taught. But then when I went to college, all of a sudden I start getting all this other information that there's something else about the Bible and creation and God, and it started challenging my understandings. But I just, calmed down, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna just settle with believing the Bible, what the Bible is telling me. But it becomes harder and harder when you start facing people who are claiming to be, well, they're not claiming, they are. They're much more educated than I am. And they're saying historical, archaeological, and all these different things, and that there's problems with the Bible. And, I've always had a big issue with people who try to discredit the Bible to begin with, because I really do believe that if the Bible has been corrupted in one book or anywhere, then the entire Bible there's no confidence in it. Come on in. Yeah, come on in, guys. We just started our class. Yeah, there's lots of places, so don't be shy.
We need to grab a mask or something. We saw you sign.
I think we're enough distance for now. We'll worry about it after. We've got some, but thank you for asking. Yeah, it's good to have you with us. So, we're live streaming as well, so it's kind of like all over the place. So we're talking on live stream, and so it's good to have you with us, especially like with the COVID. So we've done about everything, trying to cover all the bases. So we've been going through the apologetics and looking at different ways that we to defend our faith, and we've covered a tremendous amount of information today throughout to this date. This morning, like I said, looking at the book of Genesis and looking at the idea of, is the Bible something that's credible historically, or is it riddled with some problems when it comes to myth and poetry and rhetoric and all sorts of things. And it's really been challenging, even for myself as I grew up. It wasn't as prevalent as it is today, I think, in the challenging and discrediting of the Bible. And as I was saying, that I really have a problem with people who try to say that, there's corruption in the Bible. Because if there's corruption in the Bible and you can point out one area, then you really have to say then everything is suspect. Every bit of it's suspect. Then if you can point out and that this one area here that is supposedly in our belief value system, that it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, which means it's directed by God, if that's been corrupted, then everything about the Bible. So this morning we're going to take a look at looking at the idea of Genesis, and is it history? And I want to really recommend, and I'm going to let this video really do a lot of the teaching, because I think that it does a much better job than what I could do. But we're going to start out with, let's take a little bit of a review from last week, because I think that's important. We talked about pain, evil, and suffering, and the reason of it. A lot of people try to discredit God, the existence of God, because if he's all loving and all knowing, then how in the world could this happen, having this pain, evil, and suffering? But understand that, one thing, that we were created because we're created in his image, and we were created because he loves us. And with love comes the idea that you want somebody to choose to love you. You don't want to have to beat them into it. And that's what dictators have done. And they're not loved. They're hated. They're obedient, but they're hated. And God has never wanted that of people. And so that creates free will, choice. And that was given in the very beginning of the garden. But in that giving of his choice, there's consequences in there. Those consequences are going to be like God has always said from the beginning with the tree, all the way to the receiving of the law, that there is good, follow it, and there'll be blessings, and then turn around, and if you don't, then death, destruction, pain, and misery. So those consequences initially are self-inflicted. Starting with the Garden of Eden, we chose to go ahead and mankind to eat the fruit, which triggered a whole path that God did not want us to have, but the free will. And those caused a tremendous amount of suffering. Decisions that I make today, whether they're outrightly sinful or not, everything that I choose has an outcome and a consequence. Whether it's good, maybe it's better, maybe it's best. But every action has a result in which the result is either good or bad. And when it comes to moral choices, the same consequences that, we inflict those on us. And the people around me are suffering because of the consequences of my sins. If I choose to be a drug abuser, then the consequences are going to be that my family is probably going to suffer. If I choose to be somebody who is not able to control my rage and my ability to forgive and my gentleness, then the people around me are probably going to be physically and verbally abused. And so there's pain and suffering that the people around me are also. So others inflict it because of their choices. I will suffer because somebody who has, decided to do something corrupt and rob a bank and then come outside and just start firing off his weapon and people get killed, that doesn't discredit God. What that shows is the big difference between good and evil. The choices that person made to go ahead and fire that weapon or take that action is inflicting on others. Again, it has nothing to do with that idea. We also know the natural law. When we look in the perfect world that was created by God, it was in a perfect balance itself. The world itself has been corrupted because of the result of our sin, and the flood was an incredible, disruptive geological event that, if you look back again, we won't go into it, but it's not the same. And now we have volcanoes, we have earthquakes, we have hurricanes, we have, we impact the climate, all sorts of things. So yes, they're terrible, but does that say that there's no God? No. So let's talk about what I think when we talk about the Bible and a lot of these questions when it comes to this guy named, anyone heard of him? Who hasn't heard of him, right? Maybe kindergarten they're not teaching him yet, but they are. They're probably teaching him, but they just don't use the name. But Charles Darwin, I think, is an amazing character. I think little people know that prior to 1859, when he wrote that book, when it came out on the origin of species, that he actually went to Cambridge University and received a degree in theology. His whole goal was to become a minister. And he studied biology, and he had classes in geology, but his degree was in theology. And after he went on his voyage on the HMS Beagle and came back after 5 years, he comes back and he writes this proposal, this idea that looking at those animals, and that seeing the way that birds and things have changed, but they're similar and all this, started to develop the idea of what we have been pounded with is evolution. And that's why you say, well, Ron, wait a minute, how's that tie into, is Genesis history or not? It's huge. This was where the paradigm started to shift. Because prior to the book coming out in 1859, there wasn't a question about whether the book of Genesis was historical. And the real question comes to between Genesis 1 and chapter 1 and chapter 11. And if you go back and we were to dig all those little stories out there, it seems that I think the contradiction or the hypocrisy is some people will say, well, after 11, it's okay. Because now we have Abraham and we have historical. But up to chapter 11, oh man, I don't know, that flood, that snake talking, that, those things like that. You can't have it both ways. But up until 1859, everybody believed and saw it as a form of history. Now, whether you believed in the God or not, and you believed in the Yahweh God of the Jews and the Hebrews and all that, it still was accepted as a historical document for those people, that people. Just like we'd look at the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Egyptians and look at their historical documents and writings that we've retrieved, we'd say that those are historical. And up until Darwin and evolution, that's the way that the book of Genesis in the Old Testament was received. It wasn't questioned. But you see, in a lot of ways, and even Darwin had to admit that he had to kind of get rid of God in order to compromise. And in the second revision of his own autobiography, this is a quotation from his book. He says here, I gradually come by this time to see that the Old Testament, from its manifestory false history of the world and from its attributing to God the feelings of revengeful tyrant, was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of any barbarian. So he had to get rid of God because he knew there was a contradiction in it. And the irony as well is when he proposed his idea of evolution and he sent it to one of the most world-renowned anthropologists and others, they looked at him and they wrote him back and they said, you got some serious problems. There's some serious problems with your, and he even admitted in his book, if you read it, he even said, yeah, there's some problems, but I think that when the fossils are dug up, that it'll support what I'm saying. Guess what? They've never been found. But man, the atheists and people who are ungodly have just grabbed this as their new Bible and just drove it off. But you can see where he had to as well look at the idea and separate God from the factual presentation in Genesis. In a famous debate, Wolseley Teller said, if evolution is accepted, Adam and Eve go out. That's the story. The Bible, fable, is interesting mythology, but it doesn't present the true picture of the origin of man. So you can see where this started to come in, and this is in the 19th and 20th century, that where all of this has come up, the questioning of whether Genesis is myth or is it historical. So it doesn't stop there with the atheists. We can accept that. That's okay. I get it. They don't believe in God to begin with, so they're going to attack every aspect of it. But what's frightening to me is the number of quotes that I found, and I really just had to cut them out. But there's a couple here, and one of them that and I have this in my library, is a New Illustrated Davis Dictionary of the Bible. And look what he says, and this is in his book in 1944, page 119. The recital of the facts of creation is obviously not literal historical record. So that's a problem, because as we're going to look at, is that when you think about it, if it's just poetry, allegory, then what is creation an allegory for? Evolution, you see? In other words, is it representing something that's real? It's kind of trying to teach us something else. So what about sin? I mean, look at there's so many fundamental things that even the plan of salvation then really is a myth. Because that's where the problem started. And so if you're going to say that it's myth, then everything about it as well is a serious problem. So I'm going to go ahead and let this video go. And it's going to take me a little bit to kind of jump around and get it fired up here and over there. But so give me just a second here. Okay. So go ahead. This is a Bible study. So, any thoughts about what I've said? Any things in your opinions, or
Adam and Eve themselves and their lives in the years that would come afterwards.
So that takes us back to the original garden. How do you see all that, and what are the implications of looking at Genesis from the historical perspective?
Well, in the same way that I think we can trace the creation of ziggurats and pyramids to an early time where people were trying to get back to the mountain of Eden, because in Ezekiel we're told that Eden was actually on a mountain. I think we can see that the proliferation of gardens in the heart of the life of men as they began to spread out across the earth, the one common thing that we see over and over again in every civilization is the desire to have gardens. It points to this sort of linear trajectory from the early chapters of Genesis all the way through the history of mankind. It's not just an anthropological sort of phenomenon. It's woven into the longings that we have as human beings that we see through all civilizations and all cultures.
George, we have been examining the implications of the two different paradigms associated with looking at Genesis. From your perspective, what do you see in terms of implications of the historical aspect of Genesis versus another paradigm that would move it into some sort of an analogy?
One of the things that I think is very evident from the Genesis account is that it was intended to be understood as linear history. In fact, that's one of the things that the Bible introduces to civilizations that you don't see anywhere else. The Greeks had a cyclical view of history. The Egyptians had a peripatetic view of history. You have the chaos theory of the Babylonians. With the Bible, you have this notion that there is providence, a purposeful plan by God Himself, that is then worked out across time in a linear, understandable, traceable fashion. That's woven all through the book of Genesis. And as you've seen with the toldos, the structure of the generations, it is intended to be understood as history. Interestingly, it's always been understood as history. Throughout all of the ages, various theological traditions, East and West, it's always been understood as an historical account where details are actually marking out specific individuals, accomplishing specific goals, doing specific things in a specific location. And these things can be mapped, they can be understood. The overarching themes of the Bible can be grasped by the reader when you connect all of those dots. Strip away all of that, and what you have are fine-sounding epigrams, marvelous, virtuous notions without any coherent structure.
Well, George, let's go back to the text for a minute and kind of walk me through what has happened there and the implications as we look at that historical narrative.
One of the things that you see in Genesis chapter 1 is the structure for time. The universe is created for a 24-hour day. That is clearly portrayed in Genesis chapter 1. And so everything from the way our sleep cycles and the way our work cycles work all come from that definitive historical account there. When Moses gives the people the Ten Commandments, and then all of the case law that follows the Ten Commandments, that is based on an assumption of a 7-day week of 24-hour days. All of those case laws are really predicated on that as an historical understanding. When you get to Genesis chapter 2, you start to see the meaning and purpose of man, what man is here for, that the creation was actually ordered in such a way to facilitate man's purpose, man's destiny, man's calling, even man's relationship with the created order itself. Of course, in Genesis chapter 3, we see the disruption of everything by the fall. And the implications of an historical fall, an actual man and an actual woman who actually yielded to actual sin, have then implications all through the rest of the Bible. In fact, one could say that the book of Romans, for instance, which lays out the doctrine of salvation, is essentially meaningless if what Paul is referring to is not an actual historical event. When we get to Genesis chapter 4, we start to see the implications of chapters 1, 2, and 3 now applied to culture and the spreading of men and nations across the face of the earth. That continues all the way to Genesis chapter 11. And between Genesis 3 and Genesis 11, we have the laying out of this understanding of generations, of covenantal succession. In Genesis chapter 6, we have the great flood all the way through Genesis chapter 9. If you start to have localized floods, then you actually rip the roots out of our understanding of covenant, out of our understanding of judgment, out of our understanding of promise, the character and nature of God's faithfulness to fulfill His promises. You even begin to pull at the roots of ideas like grace, the common grace that is extended to all men, and the peculiar particular grace that is poured out on those who are redeemed. All of that really is linked inextricably to the historical account of Genesis 1 through 11.
And it seems that even Peter is taking that event of the flood, for example, as a historical event and laying it in the context of what he's pointing to, a judgment that will come. So even judgment is a part of understanding that historical record.
And if you take away the metaphor that Jesus and Peter both use of the flood as a way to understand the doctrine of salvation, you start to lose a grip on everything that the Bible is intended to show us, to teach us, and to shape in us.
So if we take the historical record and turn it into poetry, what you're saying is that we lose a lot, if not almost everything, that Christianity is based upon.
Yes, although what I would say is that much of the Bible is incredibly poetic. It's beautifully written. Just because something is beautifully written does not mean that it is not true history. You can have all of these poetic structures in place, and we see it all through the Bible. There are multiple genres that we see evidenced in the Bible. Even when you take the genre of the Psalms, there are multiple genres within the genre. That doesn't negate the truthfulness of it. We all know people who can say things incredibly well and beautifully, and we say, oh, I wish I could have said it like that. That does not mean that because it's said well, that it is somehow mythological.
Do we have evidence in the rest of the Scripture that those writers, we believed inspired by God, were looking at Genesis from a historical perspective?
Yes, an emphatic yes. All through the minor prophets, there are constant references back to the events of Genesis and Exodus, treating those events as historical events. You can't read the Psalms without a constant reminder of the history of redemption, which is a series of sequenced providential acts by God amongst His people in space, in time, in history. When we come forward all the way to the New Testament, not only are genealogies essential for our understanding the Gospels, both for Matthew and for Luke, but in the Gospel of John and in the Gospel of Mark, there are constant references back to Old Testament events as actual history. The Apostle Paul understood the events of the early chapters of Genesis as formative, not only for our understanding of history, but for relationships between men and women and their children, the character and nature of marriage, rightness and wrongness in moral relations, including sexuality. All of that is assumed from those early chapters of Genesis, oftentimes quoting the passages verbatim. Sometimes in the apostolic preaching, they would quote from several different translations. The Hebrew or the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, or an Aramaic vernacular translation. So they're mixing and matching and saying, all of this points to the same reality. This is history. This happened. It's been recorded. And we're to understand where we are and where we go in light of where we've been.
And when Jesus was asked the question about marriage, he pointed them back to that historical record, did he not?
He did, and he quoted Moses specifically as an historical figure who actually said something that was recorded in the historical account.
I think most Christians, when we talk about, for example, the life of Christ, that he was crucified, that he was buried, that he spent 3 days, those are understood to be historical accounts.
Right.
Why is it that when we look at the account in Genesis, that we have a tendency not to want to do that?
We have a tendency not to do it because we're constantly exhorted to not see it that way.
From the culture around us?
The culture around us, from theologians, modern theologians who are trying to somehow, in their minds, fit the truths of Scripture with the so-called discoveries of science, when oftentimes they really don't know the science. They've not sat down and talked to hydrologists or geologists or archaeologists. They make assumptions usually from pop science and pop culture. Even on matters where there is wide disagreement among scientists. They'll pick and choose which science they're going to believe. Which, if you know anything about the history of science, you know is an incredibly unreliable path. So we're constantly bombarded with this message that we have to adjust our view. A lot of Christians, I know, will take the first 3 chapters of Genesis and create a separate category for them. And then from Genesis chapter 4 on, they feel like, okay, this now is reliable history. But if you look at the genre of writing, the character and nature of the vocabulary, the structure of the whole book of Genesis with its regular punctuations of the toldos, there's literally no linguistic or literary reason to do that. So what's the reason? Well, we've baptized a worldview onto that, and we accommodate ourselves to it.
George, is this a recent phenomenon of looking at Genesis more poetry than historical, or does that extend back farther than the modern era?
Well, it's relatively recent. It really starts with the Enlightenment and higher critical theories of the 18th and 19th centuries. But you can actually trace the trajectory back to the chaos of the 14th century. The 14th century was the 100 Years' War, the bubonic plague, the Babylonian captivity of the church, the Avignon papacy. There's just chaos. And so poets and thinkers began to reflect on the dissolution of Christendom and what might replace it. They gathered in places like the city of Rome, where they would look around and they would see the ruins of what was once a glorious city. And they would think, we need to recover that. So the Renaissance was actually not the birth of something. It wasn't a renaissance. It was instead a recovery of an old pagan worldview, deliberately trying to recover the pagan view of aesthetics, the pagan view of architecture, the pagan view of history. You start to see this even in Renaissance paintings, where you have the mythology of Greece and Rome woven into actual historical events during the time of the Renaissance. So you're introducing these ideas, these pagan ideas. Well, once you do that, then it becomes a critique of Christendom itself, the assumptions about the Bible, about morality, about the nature of the family. And once you do that, then there has to be a way to get at the non-historicity of the Bible. And the easiest mark are the early chapters of Genesis. That's where the higher critical theories come from. The Enlightenment, which really was a darkening of the thinking of man and the narrowing of the thinking of man, comes directly out of the Renaissance and the recovery of all of those pagan ideas. Suddenly, Aristotle and Plato become much more authoritative than Moses or the Apostle Paul.
So Darwin is not a genesis of a new thought. He arises already in a fairly strong stream of thinking.
Yeah, Darwin really comes late to the game. As he actually mentions in the preface to Origin of Species, he talks about the fact that he felt like he had to rush the publication of the book because all of those ideas were floating around everywhere. In a sense, the evolutionary ideas of the ancient Greeks, that pagan view of cyclical history, of sort of an evolution out of chaos, and then a return back to chaos, and then an evolution back out of it, that becomes kind of a reigning assumption for many intellectuals in the West who were trying to throw off the shackles of Christendom. So what Darwin did was he went looking for proof of his assumptions. He's operating from presuppositions, and he goes looking for proof. If anyone actually reads Darwin's works, you start to realize there's not a lot of science there. There's just a lot of assumptions, and then picking and choosing peculiar examples that might illustrate his presuppositions. There's no scientific evidence there, just a lot of observations and suppositions. Those observations and suppositions come out of that Enlightenment, Renaissance recovery of a pagan worldview. It's a step back in time, not a step forward.
All right. That's all I have for class. Any thoughts about it? Good? Bad? When I watched this is like about the fifth time I've watched it, and I learned. And I did beat up Darwin. I mean, as like the Genesis, and I think that what he pointed out was more accurate, looking at the idea that he was just on the stage kind of late and taking the concepts that were just prevalent during that time due to all those catastrophic things that happened during the Middle Ages, and then kind of put it in a book. But it really is reflective. But it is dangerous. To me as Christians, we need to hold fast that the Bible is accurate and that it is the way God says it. And the biggest challenge, I think, where it starts with is creation. When we start talking about how many days it took, and it does not fit into man's concepts. And so that's the crack in that egg that seems also today when I talk to people is looking at the idea that these are myths, these are stories, they couldn't have been. The idea of the water, even the miracles that occurred. I find people coming up with all sorts of timelines of historical catastrophic events that happened within the Middle Eastern timeline, and that's what then created the phenomenon that Egypt was feeling was a repercussion of some other geological catastrophic thing, that a volcano blew up and all this other things, and explaining away the idea that, that this was something miraculous and specifically designed to punish Egypt and to free God's people. And that's dangerous again. I mean, it makes sense. I watched it and I'm like, yeah, I get it. But I also have the same comeback and saying, well, everything that God uses is natural. Isn't nature natural? I mean, it's the power of things that God uses. I mean, when he destroyed the earth, did he use anything that was unnatural? He used natural forces of physics, the thermal, the laws of thermodynamics, and he ruptured and created earthquakes. And so, but it's always around us, this idea of trying to destroy the miracles, destroy the idea of the flood. All those things are dangerous to us as Christians, that we need to hold fast that the book of Genesis is a historical document, not some sort of a myth. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead, I guess, if we don't have any other comments. I'm glad to see you guys being active on chat. But if there's nothing else, we'll see you guys in a little bit.